Hello there, DT Bergen. This is Fede from home. A little bit more of a pro setup this time. Now I'm not in my hotel room. I wanted to reach out to you guys before our next get together on Tuesday for Module 3. The reason I'm reaching out is because we've received a little bit of feedback that concerns sort of this concept of where are we in the process, right? And that's totally natural. As I mentioned, one of the differences between this cohort and the last cohort is that we decided to put in much more intensity in the way that we go through the 5 steps of design thinking. For this year, we wanted to bring in a little bit more pressure to jump from one phase to the next phase, to the next phase, to the next phase, in order to be able to iterate much more than we did last year. I still believe that it's the best way to go, but part of this speedy process brings, of course, a little bit of confusion, a little bit of ambiguity and uncertainty and unclarity. And what I want to do today is hopefully clear that just a little bit up. Because I will never clear it completely, because the whole idea of innovation is that you're going to feel that you're sort of dancing in that unknown, and that's just part of it. But let's start with this empathy phase, right? This was what we focused on since the very beginning, right? What the teams did is essentially they went out into the world and asked really wide open questions, right? This is kind of the process of needs finding. The more I use this word, the more I like it, because it's just going out there and identifying needs. Many times, particularly when design thinking is used, we don't really know what the needs actually are, right? If we were more focused on addressing particular needs or maybe even working on particular solutions, we'd be using the lean methodology or other agile or scrum techniques. But in this particular case, design thinking helps us start with a very wide focus. Some teams, by the way, were able to narrow that focus down to particular needs quite quickly. Others took them a little bit longer, but the idea of starting very wide is that it gives you a huge opportunity to explore a lot of different perspectives for the organization since the very start. So we've got our empathy phase here, right? After the empathy phase, of course, we need to little by little focus down that exploration, right? We begin maybe by identifying multiple needs, right? Little by little, we start to close that down to a couple of key needs, and in particular, a key user. And hopefully by now, this is starting to resemble what we already discussed, this concept of a POV, right? So I'm writing D for definition, which is kind of the general word we use to describe that second phase where we synthesize and make sense of our empathy work. And the way we do it is through a very strong point of view, right? This point of view we discussed already, right? A lot of the teams in Module 2 arrived with a relatively solid point of view. Some teams not so much, which is perfectly fine, because the whole point of points of views, as we've already mentioned, is to massage them, tweak them, many times significantly change them. So don't worry too much about having the perfect point of view. What it does is it helps the team feel a little bit more focused, directed, and generally in control of the innovation process, so that when we can move on to the next step, which is ideation. This is your chance to come up with a lot of different ideas that address the particular needs of the user that you identified during the second stage of definition. Also, last module, the teams were able to come up with a lot of different ideas. We shared a lot of different techniques that you can use to come up with those ideas in order to address the particular needs of your user. And this, of course, is the moment when the process starts to open up again, right? It starts to get really explorative, really expansive, really divergent, because you're essentially exploring the idea realm of the process. There needs to be a moment though when this ideation process starts to converge again, starts to close down again, right? You go from exploration to exploitation one more time. And the way you do that is that you start to pick certain ideas that you want to test out, right? Because as we've mentioned, these ideas are all very fuzzy, they're very subjective, and we never really know if they're gonna work or not until we bring them into action, into the real world, from 2D to 3D, right? And this is where rapid prototyping comes in. This is the part that Martin Steinert discussed, that you can bring in essentially any idea into the real world to get as much feedback as possible. And so after ideation, we go straight to prototyping, right? In prototyping, you can use role plays, you can use cardboard, you can use glue guns and plastilin and wires and all sorts of very rough things and processes in order to communicate your ideas to the wider public, to people inside of your organization, and even, of course, to your teammates. Right? So the natural next step immediately after building something is testing, because prototypes are not for ourselves, prototypes are for the world, right? It's to learn, to communicate, to see if things work, to see if things don't work, right? And if they don't work, then we start to move back into the process, right? Because it probably won't work in the very first time. That's the whole point. And so if I add these lines to finish off the process, we go from the enormous exploration of ideation to little by little by little by little by little closing the process out to the testing phase, right? And if we bring that back, this idea of this design thinking process being completely iterative and non-linear, then sooner or later we need to start moving backwards into the process, right? We could potentially go back to empathy once we finish going through the entire stage. And that's probably where a lot of you are, right? You've developed a very, very rough prototype and you want to see how people feel about that prototype. And so you use your same skills, your same questions, right? Your same observation techniques that we discussed in the very, very start of this course. But now you have something in your hand, right? Another thing that potentially you could do after testing your prototypes for the first time is maybe go back to your definition stage, right? And ask yourselves, are we really addressing the right needs, right? Are we actually approaching the correct kind of user? Are we defining this point of view correctly, right? You could potentially also immediately go back to ideating and come up with more ideas. Maybe this prototype didn't gain as much traction as you thought, and you had several other ideas that were exciting, that certain people in your team had chosen. Then you can go straight back to those ideas and prototype them again, right? You prototype those ideas and then immediately you test them again. So as you can see, this process starts to get really, really non-dynamic, non-linear, very dynamic, very, very fuzzy, right? If you remember one of the slides that Martin used, instead of showing the innovation process like this, the innovation process was more like this, right? And then little by little by little, it started to get more and more and more and more manageable and logical and certain. But this phase, this fuzzy front end, that's where we are now, right? And so we need to learn to deal with all those uncertain paths and all those sort of vague decision-making processes in order to be able to come up with something that no one else has come up with, right? So just to recap this very, very quickly, to give you a better grounding as to where we are now, we began by empathizing, by learning, by exploring the world, by exploring needs, right? Little by little, we started to get a better hunch as to who's our key user and what are his or her needs, right? We also explored this concept of insight, which is attached to those needs, right? Because our point of view is user, needs, insight. Once we come up with our relatively solid point of view, we come up with a lot of different ideas that address that point of view. These ideas are generally very, very subjective, and so what we need to do is to bring them into the objective 3D world as quickly as possible, and so we build rapid, very rapid prototypes. Once we've developed these prototypes, the natural thing to do is to expose them into the world, because our prototypes are not our babies. They're essentially the babies of everybody else. And so we send them out there. We learn from exposing those prototypes, and then we go all the way back to the process, whether we can empathize maybe, whether we can redefine our point of view, whether we can address other ideas. That's completely up to the team. By the way, given that your teams have 6 members, maybe you can split the team in half, right? And have 3 people go and continue the empathy phase. And other 3 people maybe readdress the point of view or ideate more. You can take this as however you wish. It's important for you, though, to start to get into the multiple iterative process, right? Because that's where the true learning takes place. The first 2 months of this course was very linear, right? Step by step by step, just to give you guys a general sense of how this works. But the truth is that when you get really comfortable with the process, where you become a true expert in innovation and design thinking, is when you start to deal with this really intense, iterative, and dynamic process. General conclusion to this, right? There are these key 5 steps of design thinking, right? The 5 steps are very much intertwined, and they're very much iterative and non-linear. And finally, the key here, and this is the key message to all of those you who are still feeling a little bit uncomfortable, is that uncomfort is a complete and natural part of this process. If you were feeling that you got everything under control, that everything is understandable, and that you've made sense of the whole process, you would be doing something wrong, right? So you need to feel somehow that somebody's pulled the rug from under your feet, because that's the most natural way of learning design thinking. Hopefully, little by little, the more we get together and the more your team gets together, you start to gain more confidence. Okay, I'm looking forward to seeing you guys next module on Tuesday. Just a heads up, you will be presenting your prototypes during the second session of this module. General criteria to this presentation: we want to hear about your learning process, not only about the prototype, but how did you get there? Right? What was it like to go out into the world and get feedback? Right? Where did you struggle the most during these last 2 months throughout the design thinking process? How did you get yourself and your team unstuck? Are you still stuck? Where are you stuck? Why are you stuck? It's very important to essentially use these 10 minutes to describe and reflect and communicate the process to the rest of the teams, so that those teams can also give you feedback, suggestions, and encouragement along the way. Having said that the learning process is important, of course the prototypes are also important, because they're essentially the embodiment of your learning. And so we're going to be really looking into the kinds of prototypes that you've built, right? That it's important to make these prototypes interactable so that people in the room can interact and engage and learn from those prototypes. If you want to create role plays, because a lot of you are creating services, please go ahead and do so, right? So just really give us a general understanding of your prototypes, your previous processes, and also maybe what your next steps will be. We're going to give you approximately 10 minutes per team to present, right? If you need a little bit more, we won't be too strict about that. And then we're going to make sure to leave at least 10, maybe even 15 minutes after each person presents, after each team presents, so that you can get as much feedback and question and answer period as possible. So the goal is, of course, to use this as practice, to learn how to present. I'll be talking about presentation skills during the first session, the day before you actually present. And so it's a process of learning how to present, about showing us where you are in the process, getting feedback from your prototypes, and also having you as an observer pitch in with feedback. So there's a lot of stuff going to be going on. Don't stress out too much about this, right? It's more important that you focus on the process and then the creation of your prototypes than on making this perfect PowerPoint presentation. That's not the goal of next module, right? If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Okay, I will see you soon. Ha det bra!